as people join, that's great. Well, I'll get us kicked off here. My name is Megan Townsend, and I am one of the owners of Altitude Arborist. I'll introduce Hunter here in a minute. He's the other owner and my husband. And tonight we are going to be educating people on how to plant a tree. And there are, various types of trees that we'll go into in terms of the size and how they're grown. And I'll tell you a little bit about Hunter here. Hunter is a certified arborist and also has a degree in forestry from CSU. So basically what that means is he knows what he's talking about when it comes to planting trees. And we are owners of Altitude Arborist. We've been in business for just over 5 years now. And we are parents of kiddos who go to Westgate Community School. So we got in touch with Holly here at the school and, proposed, hey, let's teach people how to plant these trees that they may have just gotten from the school. And if those of you on the webinar, aren't from the Westgate community or didn't happen to grab a tree, we can still teach you about planting trees that you may get later in the season or even next year. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Hunter mostly because he's got the knowledge.
Awesome. Well, thanks guys. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be on with everybody tonight, and I'm happy to share some knowledge. So let's go ahead and get started if we want to go to that first slide or second. All right, so basically what we're going to go over too is how to plant and care for your basic trees that you can get at the nursery and what you guys got from the school, which were the 2 grown seedlings. And then the container grown trees and ball and burlap trees are the other extremely common stock that we see from the nurseries. We'll go ahead and move on.
Oh, here's our first poll. So if you want to jump on at slido.com and the password is trees, give us a shout and tell us how you're feeling about tree planting. So are you a brown thumb? You've never planted anything in your life and you are a certified plant killer. Help, you're terrified. Or are you a yellow thumb? My houseplants are doing okay. Oh, oops, and I messed up and I've planted a thing or two. Or a green thumb. I am a plant whisperer, just here to be sure these guys know what they're talking about. So if you guys want to jump on and participate, if not, that's cool too. We've got a brown thumb in the house. That's all right. We'll hopefully turn you into at least a yellow thumb.
There's hope for all of us. It's okay. We'll bring you along. We got a yellow thumb. 50-50. All right, who's left?
Any smarty pantses out there who are green thumbs? Oh, I disappeared again. There we go.
Yeah, stop disappearing. All right.
Okay,
maybe we'll go ahead and move on and go from there. So just briefly who we are as a company. You guys have probably seen our cars in the car line at Westgate. If not, you may have seen our big trucks around town. You may have seen us monkeys climbing in trees and doing those sorts of things. So we are a full service tree care company. We provide services ranging from full tree removal to pruning to planting to plant health care. As Megan said, I am a certified arborist and we have one other certified arborist on staff. And we are fully licensed and insured and all those good things. And we are a Westgate family. And we do provide 10% back of any of our proceeds for Westgate families back to the school as a donation. Right. So going on, so the biggest thing that we see in our field is picking the right tree or the right location for the right tree. That's going to be critical for those people who chose the ponderosa pines instead of the Rocky Mountain junipers. When we talk about the right location for these trees, it's important to look at the mature height of the tree. Now, what they are now is a 15 and 16, 18 inch, or even a 10-foot tree will go just about anywhere in most people's yard, but that's not what they're going to be when they're 40, 50, 60 years old. So it's important to look at that mature height of the tree and the mature width of the tree, and that'll give you some good guidelines of where to put that tree. The ponderosa pines, for example, they're only about 16 inches tall at the most for a root to the top of the tree. But at maturity, they're going to be 50 to 80 feet tall in the front range, somewhere in that ballpark, with a spread of 30 to 40 feet. So they're going to, if you put them in the right place, they'll be great and thrive. Put them in the wrong place and they may run into power lines. They may spread over into several neighbors' yards. They may cause issues for flower beds, grass, all those sorts of things. The junipers are a little more tolerable and can fit in a few more places, so 20 to 30 foot heights and a little narrower, 8 to 12 feet, but they can also be sheared and pruned to keep them at a specific height and shape if you want. One or two more things to consider is don't put them too close to the house. Foundations are important. And power lines. Do not plant these trees under power lines. We see it all the time that the power companies come through. In fact, we saw some of that at Westgate, where they came through and pruned the trees, and it's not always the prettiest end result. And also make sure before you plant, you check with your HOA or your other municipality, usually your HOAs, to see if there's any regulations on how close to the fence line they can be, the property line they can be. Does it have to be in the front yard, the backyard? How many trees do we have to have in the front yard? Do we have to have trees in the front yard? All of those things, because the last thing you want to do is plant your tree, have it nice and healthy, doing really well. 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, somebody come in and say, hey, you have to move your tree. It's 50-50 if we can be successful in moving that tree post-establishment. So make sure you do your homework. Make sure you think about where you want this tree with the expectation that it's going to survive, not the hope that it's going to survive. All right. So what are you going to need to undertake this endeavor? Pretty straightforward for the most part, a shovel. I would suggest some sturdy shoes. Don't do it in flip-flops. You're going to need some mulch of some sort. We prefer to use natural mulch. Our stuff is all organic mulch. It's fresh mulch, so to speak. Don't use the dyed, super colored mulch. We all see that stuff. It all fades out. I don't know exactly where that color goes, but I have a suspicion that it goes up or down, either into the atmosphere or into the soil. Neither of those things are ideal. So go with the natural mulch, natural coloring. And then you're going to need some tree stakes, some straps, and some wire, some rope. These are to help stabilize the tree after it's planted. You can use wire or rope to go from the tree stake, which can be either a metal T-post or a wooden, like 2-inch wooden post that you can drive into the ground. And then the straps are incredibly critical to the success of the trees. Don't put wire around the tree. Don't put rope just right around the tree. Make sure you're using a true tree strap, which is usually a 1-inch wide piece of webbing that's going to help protect the trunk of the tree as that tree moves around and allows the tree to move a little bit without damaging the bark. And then you're going to need some water. You can either use a hose, you can use a bucket. That's up to you. But we want to make sure that new planting can get water up front to help settle the soil down around the root ball of the tree, or in this case, the bare root seedlings, bare roots of the trees. But then also long-term care of the tree to make sure we can continue that watering practice for the best survival possible.
And then, it's probably pretty obvious, but with these tiny trees, if you just got a tiny tree from Westgate, you don't need to stake those just now. But you may want a little bit of fence or something to protect them from bunnies and from dogs running over them and that type of a thing.
Right. Oh, another one of these.
All right, Slido poll. What should you do with your tube-grown tree when you get it home? Set it outside till you're ready to plant, keep it in a cool, dark place and keep the roots moist, or just put it in a bucket of warm water?
Give me a minute.
You guys are quick. All right, so our two contestants that have joined the game, I think you're on the right track. If you said you had a brown thumb, I think you're moving into the yellow territory at least. So, some common sense goes a long ways here. However, we see this practice not always as common sense as you would think. When you look at some of the way trees are stored at some of the big box stores, it's a little scary seeing trees on the blacktop in the middle of a sunny parking lot. there's no way those trees are staying cool. There's no way those root balls are staying moist, and whatnot. So you're absolutely right. If we want to go to the next slide, keep it in a cool, dark place and keep the roots moist. Don't put it in a bucket of water. Don't leave it out in the sun. If I'm assuming these came kind of wrapped either in the tube or some sort of a wrapping, we want to keep that intact. We want to keep it around those roots as long as we can to help protect and keep that root structure as healthy as we can. So planting the tube grown trees is relatively straightforward. It's definitely the easiest method of planting. However, if not done relatively correctly, the survival rate can be pretty low. So it's really important on a couple of these key points. Now, this is just simply a technique. Some of our clay soils may or may not lend itself as well to this one shovel, two scoop method. But I hope it does for everybody's sake. So the biggest thing is using a shovel. With most of the bare root seedlings, you don't need a big hole. So all you're going to do basically is put a shovel on the ground and rock it one way, pull that shovel out and pull the soil out, and then put it back in and pull it out. So you kind of have this nice open trench, if you will. You're going to take that seedling that you've kept in the cool, dry place, and you're going to take it out, but you're going to look at it first and make sure how it needs to go in the hole and orient it in the direction you want it. It can be a little hard to tell with tiny little baby trees, so do your best. Making sure those bigger branching points are facing a good direction and things like that. Go ahead and take the wrapping off and try to straighten the roots out the best you can, because we don't want those roots girdling around that hole. We want them going straight up and down if we can. And then go ahead and set it gently in the hole and take some of that dirt and just slowly kind of put it back in around the base of those roots the best you can, and then slowly fill in that hole. I know on here it says to kind of, just push it in the hole with soil, or the soil back in the hole, and then tamp it down with your heel. With the bare root seedlings, I like to try to make sure you're not putting big dirt clods in that hole that are going to create a lot of empty pore space. In other words, a lot of oxygen around those roots. The roots die in a full oxygen environment. So what we want to do is make sure we can try to break that soil down to a finer particulate size, put it down around the roots, and try to minimize the amount of pore space or the amount of oxygen that's in contact with those roots. And then the next step to this that's not really shown is watering it in. It's super, super important with all the plantings to water in these trees really well, giving them excess water at the beginning, which is going to help break down some of that soil into even smaller particulates. And it's going to help them kind of settle in around that root structure so we can get rid of even more of that oxygen. That's where you're going to see a bunch of bubbles come out of there and things like that. That's all oxygen escaping, and it's all a good thing. And then you're going to take some mulch and put around that tree. We usually say out to the drip line of the tree, which is the outer extent of the branches of the tree. That's not very far on these guys. I would go, 8 or 10 inches around, make a nice circle, a couple inches deep at least, but don't put it right up against the trunk of the tree. Keep it an inch or two away from that tree. It's going to help retain more moisture. It's going to do some nutrient cycling and put some nutrients back in the ground as that mulch breaks down. A lot of benefits from the mulch. So definitely don't skip that step. And then the only other thing I would say is these trees are fragile. They're not like a container or ball and burlap tree from the nursery who's still fragile, but a little more durable. These guys are fragile. So please try to get them in the ground as soon as you can. The survivability of them is going to reduce with every day that they sit unattended and not in the ground. All right. So container growing trees, these are the ones we see most often in the big box stores, along with lots of nurseries. They're the ones in the big plastic containers, 5, 10, 30, 40 gallon containers, depending on how big of a tree you're buying. There's a few things to keep in mind with these guys. And one of them that I forgot to mention on the bare root seedlings as well. So one of the really big ones is the root flare. It's hard to see on the young trees, but you'll still see it on these bare root seedlings. So if you look at the trunk below the branches where it comes down and just starts to flare out before it turns into roots, you want that to be at the final grade of the landscaping. There's the old adage of plant the trees deep and they'll do the best. That's not really true. Science has shown us that trees that are planted too deep don't get enough oxygen transport through the soil to those roots, not just pure oxygen, but they do need oxygen. So if they're not getting enough oxygen movement through the soil, they're not going to be able to go through all their processes to live. So find that root flare, plan on putting that at the final grade of the landscaping around it. And then you're going to dig your hole. So you're going to dig that hole to be as deep as that root flare. You don't need to go deeper. For the containerized trees, they're probably the easiest to plant, in my opinion, because you don't need the hole to be 3 times the size of the root ball. You don't need it to be an exact dimension. They're fairly forgiving. So there is some older mentality out there still floating around of digging these holes that are 2 or 3 times the size of the root ball. I think most of us have heard that, and that's why a lot of people are afraid to do plantings of this size, is because of the digging involved. A lot of the new science out there shows that if we do that, all we do is train the roots to grow out of that root ball and in a circle around that hole of loose soil that we just made, rather than growing out into the parent material of the harder clay or harder loam, whatever is the parent material around that tree. So if we limit the size of the hole and do a good job backfilling it and watering it in, those roots have to grow out into the parent material rather than growing around in a circle around that new hole we just dug. So we dug our hole, and number 1. Number 2, we're going to check for girdling roots. Usually take it out of the container, knock it on the sides a few times with a shovel, pull that container off and look at it. A lot of times in the container growing trees, because they're growing in those containers for a while, you'll see roots growing around the outside of the container. It's a really good idea to do a couple different things. Usually we cut an X on the bottom of the tree to help any of those roots going around in a circle. And then we'll actually cut a couple slits down 3 or 4 times on the outside of that tree to help break up a lot of those girdling roots. It's really hard to make sure there's no girdling roots, but do the best you can. You'll see them as soon as you take those containers off, you'll see lots of root mass growing in circles. You're not going to hurt the tree by cutting through some of those and preventing that. There's plenty of root mass in there for that tree to survive. So then at 3, you're going to go ahead and drop that tree gently into the hole. They're relatively light, so you can move these guys around, but it's always good to look at the orientation of the tree prior to putting it in the hole. Make sure it's facing and oriented the way you want it. Make sure it's relatively straight. And then comes the backfilling, just like we did on the bare root seedlings. Again, you're gonna use the finest soil particulate you can of the native soil you dug out of the hole, put it back in, and try to get as much oxygen space out of that hole as you can. And then in 5, go ahead and water that tree in, making sure we're breaking down that soil. And you'll see in this picture, we always create kind of a water well with the excess dirt around the tree to help hold in that water, so that we can trap some water and make sure it actually penetrates down to that root zone. And then number 6 here, you can see us staking and tying up that tree. When you're staking your trees, the biggest thing is to think about which direction the prevailing wind is. Usually we can get away with 2 stakes. There are times we use 3 or 4 stakes if we're in a very windy alley where we're trying to plant. So just think about your prevailing winds and put those stakes so they're going to help provide support for the tree. Those straps on the trees, you want them at about the midway point of the tree if you can. Sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher, somewhere in that ballpark to help provide that stability we're looking for. And then the mulch goes on top of all of that. Again, out of the outer drip line of the tree. So on this guy, it was about a 3-foot wide mulch ring around the tree, 3 to 4 inches deep, and then pulled back a little bit from the actual trunk of the tree. So it's not contacting the tree directly. And I think.
So I have a question.
That was it. Yes. Answer.
When you're figuring out the prevailing winds, how are you orienting your stakes? So if I'm the tree, right? And here are the 2, wait, hang on, where am I? Here are the 2 stakes. Is the prevailing wind coming directly toward me or from the side?
No, so you want the stakes oriented in the direction of the wind. So if the wind is blowing across our screen this way, we want our stakes here and here to provide that support from the wind going back and forth. So a lot of that, we think, oh, it's a north wind or an east wind, whatever our common winds are. But think about where you're planting that, because a lot of times we have wind tunnels between homes coming down the street in a cul-de-sac, things like that. it's not always just what we hear on the news of the prevailing wind. A lot of times we have our own geographic kind of patterns and housing developments that alter those wind directions a little bit. Good question. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop in the chat and we'll get to them as we can, or at the end, one way or the other. All right, I think we can move on to the next one. So ball and burlap trees. These are usually the heavier, well, they're always heavier, usually the larger trees, usually grown at the nursery. Rarely do we see these in the big box stores just because they are a lot harder to manage. It's not uncommon for these trees to weigh several hundred pounds to more than that. So the only really big difference is these guys are going to be freshly dug out of the ground. They're going to be, the root system is going to be wrapped in burlap and then a wire basket put around it when they are sent to the nursery. So they're more fragile because they're not grown in that container. They don't have the root mass all around the entire tree. They're all around the entire container. So it's important to be as gentle with that root ball as we can, which is difficult because they're extremely heavy. The best way to mitigate that is to dig your hole a little shallower and kind of in a dish where we can roll those trees or slide them gently into that hole. We don't want to drop them. We don't want to jostle them around too much and fracture that root ball, because when we do, it introduces that oxygen back into the root structure of that tree, which can be detrimental to the tree. Other than that, honestly, it's about the same process. Find that root collar, make sure you're planting it at the height of the surrounding landscape or the final grade of the landscape. We want to cut. So once you do that, so you put the tree in the hole, it's at the right height. I like to put a little bit of backfill in around the base of the tree, and then you can cut that wire basket off and the burlap off. We try to get as much of the burlap off as we can and as much of the wire basket off as we can. Sometimes you can't get it all. So we at least always make sure we get the top 2/3 of it off, which is where a majority of the root growth is going to be. But try to get as much off as you can without hurting that root ball.
And I would say if you're hiring someone to do this, unless it's us, because we're going to do it the right way, ask how they plant. If they're using a ball and burlap tree, how are they planting the tree, and have them describe it to you. Because sadly, we have seen plenty of trees that are pretty mature actually come crashing down. And when we go to remove them, the tree is in this poor little the trunk comes into this teeny tiny little point from where they were planted, with the ball and burlap, or the burlap completely containing that root ball at planting and never removed. And that's takes out cars and houses and and gets pretty expensive to take off of those structures when it does fall down.
And you'll hear all the time that the burlap will break down in the hole, the roots will go right through it. And majority of the time that's true. The roots can go through it and it will break down. What doesn't break down is the nylon twine that's around it, holding it on. The other materials that are there. Certainly the metal basket isn't going to break down in the amount of time that root structure is going to outgrow it. So there's absolutely no reason other than laziness to not remove the burlap and not remove the wire basket, at least to that 2/3 of the mark, 2/3 of the tree. It will help the survivability long-term of that tree immensely. All right. So this is just kind of the I don't know, life cycle of the planting, if you will, or after the planting. So we've successfully got our tree in the ground. We have mulched it. We have staked it. Everything looks good. We've watered it in. Now what? This is where the survivability of the tree really comes into play, providing that it was planted correctly. So most of the containerized trees, we say they should get about 3 to 5 gallons every couple of days through the summer months. So being mid to late June, once it starts getting hot, through even the end of August, depending on our year. This year, who knows, it could still be snowing. So when it's hot during our typical summer months without a lot of moisture, every 2 to 3 days, they should get 3 to 5 gallons of water. And that's where that water well comes in around the tree. making sure that that water is getting into the root zone of the tree. These root zones are not very big. So even for a containerized tree, you know, it might only be 16, 18 inches wide and maybe 20, 24 inches deep that you're watering. So 3 to 5 gallons should be more than enough. But you have to remember that's going to dry out quickly as well, which is why the mulch is so important. Excuse me. With the tube grown trees, honestly, they're a little more difficult. Because their root zone is so small, they tend to dry out much faster. However, we don't want the trees sitting in a pool of water. We don't want them just to be in a continually wet soil environment. So it might be every couple of days, it might be every day getting a gallon or two of water. You're watering a much smaller root zone. So you need, in general, less volume of water, but more frequently. It's okay for that cycle to happen and for it to dry out a little bit and then get the water back again, dry out a little bit. That's actually healthy for the tree in most instances, providing that it's not going bone dry and causing damage through dehydration. Where we see a lot of people lose track of watering is in the winter. It's a very challenging time to water trees in Colorado, but they need the water as much in the wintertime as in the summer. Our atmosphere is so dry in Colorado that these trees lose immense amounts of water through their leaves, through their tissues, all winter long to the atmosphere. So anytime, kind of the rule of thumb we give our customers is anytime the temperature is above 40 degrees and we haven't gotten any moisture for a couple, 3, 4, 5 days, to give them 5 gallons of water, 3 to 5 gallons of water, just to make sure they're getting what they need. Now, there's always the fear of, do I drag a hose out there? If I do that, I have a hose that I have to remember to unhook. I have a hose I have to drain. I haven't taken the chance of things freezing and doing lots of damage to a home and property and all those good things. So what I have most of my homeowners do, if they're willing, is just a 5-gallon bucket from Home Depot or Lowe's, drill a 1/4-inch hole in the bottom of it, put a piece of Scotch tape or masking tape or whatever over that hole, bring it in the house, fill it up with 3, 4, 5 gallons of water, take it out to the tree, pull that piece of tape off, walk away. You know it got the water it needed. You know you didn't freeze any pipes in your house. Win-win. So the next step is the fertilizing. There's a lot of misnomers about fertilizing trees that more is better. That's not always the case. These new trees, some fertilizer is a good thing. It's not really necessary at the time of planting, but it can be beneficial. Just make sure if you want to fertilize, you're looking for a fertilizer that's low in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium. You'll see 3 numbers on most fertilizers, like a 303 or 333 or higher. That's the basically NPK number. So it's nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus and potassium that are listed on those bags. You're looking for something higher in those last 2 numbers and ideally 0 in the nitrogen front. Nitrogen only goes to the leaves or primarily goes to the leaves of the plants. Right now, we need to worry about the roots because if there's not a solid foundation for that tree, meaning the roots, that house or the tree and the leaves are going to not survive and they're going to collapse. So don't worry so much about the leaves, worry about the roots and focus on that. After that, first initial spring planting through the summer, so going into fall and then from then on, we really recommend annual or twice a year fertilizations with a balanced fertilizer mix and mycorrhiza and different things to help build a good soil profile around those trees and to make sure that they have all the nutrient base they need to help thrive moving through life. Some of our soils do a poor job at holding iron, and that's where some of these fertilizers can come in. With these trees, the ponderosa and the Rocky Mountain juniper, you're not going to have big issues with that. But some of the other maples and whatnot, we see a lot of iron deficiency and other nutrient deficiencies. It's a disappearing life. So it's good to add that fertilizer, and you can buy a lot of these low release fertilizer stakes at the big box stores, nurseries, and whatnot, or you can contact us to come out and do that treatment for you. It's extremely affordable compared to removing and replacing tree after tree after tree for just not doing some simple fertilizing. It'll go a long ways. So we put these stakes in the ground. When to remove them? We generally want to remove those support stakes 1 year after the tree is planted. These little tiny bare root seedlings might need a little more support than that. And you're obviously not going to put a 2-inch stake or a metal T-post next to these tiny little bare root seedlings. That would be overkill. A lot of times what we'll do is use a little fencing or something like that, some like snow fence or something like that. They can still have some air move through it around that tree to help block some of the wind, protect it a little bit. And a lot of times you may not need any staking. If you do need some, there's a few different things out there. Even some little dowel rods, like 1/4-inch dowel rods, something scaled back dramatically from, a 2, 3, 4-inch tree to a little tiny tree. Something that's going to hold it in place, but obviously you're not going to need a 6-foot stake to hold a 16-inch tree. So in areas that it's really windy, really wet, we do recommend leaving those stakes in for 2 growing seasons, just to help make sure there's adequate root structure to hold that tree. And even after you've pulled the stakes and the straps and the wire holding that tree, it's good to keep an eye on it for a while. Usually we try to take those off late spring, early summer, once we're kind of out of our threat of real windy, kind of crazy weather patterns. In theory, I don't know if that holds true anymore or not, but take them off at that point. Keep an eye on them. If we have those big events, keep an eye, make sure that tree isn't starting to lean. If it is starting to lean, you can put those stakes right back in the ground again and leave them in for another year or 2 years. But we don't want to leave them on for 10 years. We want to take those straps off. We want to take the wire off. We want to take those stakes out. So the tree has to support itself. The tree will actually grow and create a different type of wood, and the actual tissue of the tree will be different if it has to compensate for the wind and hold itself together rather than relying on those stakes. So it'll be a much more solid, secure, stable tree and healthier tree. A lot of times when stakes are left on too long, we see those trees just breaking in half at some point because all of a sudden a strap breaks or something happens and they've never had to support themselves, and now they have to, and they haven't been prepared for it. So it's imperative to take those stakes out of the ground in the first, I say 1 year, but sometimes that's 1 to 3 years, depending on the situation. And then after that, some pruning. Don't forget about your trees. When you plant them, if there's damaged branches, these little seedlings, don't remove anything off of them, just because removing anything is going to be hard for the tree. For trees, if there's broken branches, damaged branches, anything like that, you can go ahead and remove those when you plant them. After that, we really recommend having an arborist come out and look at that tree. After about 5 years or so, once it's established or relatively established, and you're seeing new growth, you're seeing what it's doing, it's a good time to have an arborist come look at it and help do some pruning to set it up for future success. And then we recommend regular pruning every 3 to 5 years after that to make sure that it's growing with the right form, structure, shape, that everything looks healthy, really having a full evaluation of it. And I can promise you that more frequent pruning, even if you're doing it every 3 years, will over the life of the tree help reduce the maintenance costs of that tree, because each pruning cycle, we will have to do less of that tree to keep it in optimal shape and form, rather than trying to do it every 15 years and being limited on what we can do for the tree and maybe not being able to correct major issues with it that could have been corrected when these were really young trees. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. Just
Okay.
your head for a second.
Oh, I hate it. That was a talking ghost. All right. So with that, as I mentioned, we pride ourselves on being a Westgate family. We truly appreciate the Westgate community and what everybody has done for us. And we try to give back as often as we can. So any work that we do for a Westgate family or referral from a Westgate family, which includes our pruning, removals, planting, and all our plant healthcare, along with any of our other services, 10% of that goes back to the school. Usually we kind of tally that all up and make a big donation towards, or two throughout the school year, or, when it makes sense. So just know that, I'm not trying to be a commercial necessarily, but know that if you do work with us, some of that does come back to the school or our kiddos. So you have all our contact information there. We're more than happy to answer any questions you guys have after this. If there are questions now, we can answer them. But if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to us through email or giving our office a call. I'm happy to answer those questions the best I can and help everybody out, because we want to see this tree survive. So it looks like we did get one question from Susan. How can I protect my tube tree from animals or someone with a big foot? Sounds familiar. Yeah. it is a problem. You know, we see it all the time, even with bigger trees that get run over by mowers. So the best thing you can do is preventatively put in some of those stakes. The support stakes do a really good job of warning people there's something there. You can even hang some flagging, like survey tape, orange or pink or blue or polka dot or whatever color you like, from those guy wires that are helping support the tree, so it's more noticeable. And then on these little tiny baby tube trees, I would recommend putting some sort of a fence around them, whether that's a metal fence if you're in a protected area, or some of that kind of snow fence. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that or not, but it's basically 1.5 slats of wood with wire with like an inch gap in between each board. You can put around it, so the sunlight's still going to get in, the air is still going to move through that tree, but it's going to provide some block from the elements, and it's also going to provide a safety barrier from the dog, from the dad, from the kid, whatever the case may be, the soccer ball. Because yeah, it'll be detrimental to him if you don't do something to protect him unless it's in the perfect place. So yeah, that's a great question. It is one we run into issues with dogs digging into the root systems and burrowing down, breaking trees in half, ripping them out of the ground. Usually not a cat thing, it's usually the dog. But yeah, so protect them the best you can. If you start noticing something, try to correct it before the problem continues. You're going to be regularly there every couple of days watering that tree. It's a good opportunity to take a look at the tree, see how it's doing, make sure it's thriving. You don't see bark falling off of it, broken branches, bent wires, anything like that. And if you do, try to correct them so that that tree has a good chance of moving forward. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question, put it in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Holly wants to know how much do the two trees grow
Oh,
each year?
that is a great question. That's a hard one to answer. So the ponderosas, once they're established, it's not going to be uncommon for them to put on 8 to probably 14 inches of growth a year, maybe even more under optimal conditions, but it's going to take a while for them to do that. So I would expect that first 3, 4, 5 years, you might only see a few inches of growth until they really get established and they're happy and healthy where they are. But incrementally, you should see that growth increase over time until it hits a point, it's adolescence, if you will, that it's going to grow really well and do well until it reaches old age, and then it's going to slow down. So yeah, that's a great question. The Rocky Mountain junipers are going to grow faster up front. They're going to grow, it's not uncommon to see some of the Rocky Mountain junipers put on 18 inches of growth a year. Again, it's going to take them several years to get to that point with these young tube trees. But once they do, they'll grow pretty quick until they hit kind of their maturity and start slowing down a little bit. So yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. Fungus.
Oh, how do I protect my new tree from fungus problems? That's a great question. Normally, we don't see a lot of issues with anything with the ponderosas and Rocky Mountain junipers. Some of the better things you can do is, again, making sure that it's not sitting in water all the time. Make sure it's not just in a pool of water. That mulch, make sure it's pulled away from, I don't know if I even mentioned this, so it's a good question. I think I did though. Make sure the mulch is pulled away from the trunk of the tree a couple inches. When that mulch, because mulch is really good at holding water, and that's why we use it, it holds water right against the trunk of the tree if it's against the trunk of the tree. And then you run into problems, or can run into problems with mold and different fungi and things growing in and on that trunk of the tree where it's contacting the mulch. Other than that, honestly, we don't see a lot of problems with fungus down here. Sometimes we'll see mistletoe and some other diseases, but honestly, it's not a huge problem at this elevation on the Front Range. If you're in the foothills, it's a huge issue. So if you have other issues that you know of that have been diagnosed in your yard, reach out to me and we can talk about it. It's kind of situational. But the best thing is proper watering is going to be a huge part of that. Yeah, good question. Anybody else? Going once.
Well, thank you for coming and listening to our educational webinar tonight. It's a privilege to be able to have your attention and teach you a few things. So thank you very much.
And I think, Holly, you said this was going to be recorded. So maybe we can figure out a way to share somehow to get access to it. So if you have friends, family, kids, anybody else that want to watch it, listen to it, please, feel free to share it broad and wide. And if you have any feedback for us on things we need to do differently, more than happy to take that feedback as well, so we can grow and do a better job with these as we have the opportunities.
All right, and it'll be on our YouTube channel, and we'll link it from the website, but I'll send it to you guys too.
That'd be great.
That sounds awesome. Well, thank you so much for having us and collaborating with us. And we will see you in Carline.
Bye.
All right.
All right,
Take
everybody.
care.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Happy Earth Day. Bye.